Welcome to today's program titled Proactive People Practices, Reducing Risk in a Unionizing Climate. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. For those of you who are logged into the live web presentation, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the conference by typing them into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit for this webinar, later in this presentation, we will read the CLE attendance verification code. Please write this code down as it will not be reread and is required on the CLE credit request form. During this program, you will see a QR code that you may scan to access and submit your request for CLE credit. You can also find a link to the form in the connection details email you received yesterday. Copies of the webinar recording and materials will be distributed to all attendees within a day or two following the webinar. On the next slide, you will see a legal disclaimer. This presentation has been prepared by Seyfarth Shaw LLP for informational purposes only. The material discussed during this webinar should not be construed as legal advice or a legal opinion on any specific facts or circumstances. The content is intended for general information purposes only, and you are urged to consult a lawyer concerning your own situation and any specific legal questions you may have. At this time, I would like to turn it over to our speaker for today's program, Dan Swedlow. Please go ahead.
All right, good morning, and thanks for joining me. We're going to do a real quick half hour, sort of everything you ever wanted to know about dealing with unionization in the workplace, packed into a quick morning. So there's a lot to talk about. I might talk a little bit fast, but we can always follow up if you have questions. What I want to do is kind of give you a general sense to start with about what's going on in the past couple of years. So kind of walk through where we are in the labor movement generally, and more specifically, I'm focusing on the West Coast and the Pacific Northwest because that's where I am, and we work all over the country. But I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at that. Want to focus on essentially high level what you need to know about the process. What are the basics of a union kind of coming into a workplace and going through a campaign, and then of course the big one is the do's and don'ts, basically getting an understanding of what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do, to just get a very, very high level, broad overview of those issues. And then the concept of avoidance, stopping them from coming in or stopping a spread for additional unionization in a workplace is legitimately referred to as positive employee relations, because that, as we'll talk about a little bit, that really is the core strategy that tends to work. So, all right, let's roll into it. So a lot of the data that you're about to see, and we can go to the next slide. So the data that we're going to be looking at, most of it, I just pulled off of Bureau of Labor Statistics. So there's lots of this stuff is coming from 2023 and 2024. Only a little bit of the data is really collected and reported on for this year, but it shows some interesting trends. I think the biggest trend is that we have a lot more union wins. There's general union PR, labor movement is sort of in a positive place for the most part right now. Public approval ratings are pretty high, and 79 to 81% in 23 and 24 of union wins. And we're gonna look a little bit about how that shakes out in various parts of the country, but that's a very high level of success when a union files a petition, has an election, and ultimately wins that election. Historically, those were closer to 50%. And part of the reason for that is some of the rules that have changed to make election process much faster, more difficult for employers to kind of get their ducks in a row to effectively campaign, and some of the the tricks of the trade that used to be effective to kind of slow the process down and win hearts and minds during a campaign that just don't really work anymore because it's such a quick process. Okay, let's move on. So we have a bit of an uptick, 23 to 24, but generally speaking, the primary purpose of taking a look at this slide from BLS is that this is really the highest number of union wins in elections for a long historic period of time. So they began publishing these reports in 1990. Now we're in the second highest win time frame. There's really just a significant increase in union success once they file a petition, and we'll continue to take a look at that. Okay, so this slide shows the basically a steady decline in newly organized workers, with the exception of in 2013, there was a really large bargaining unit of 44,000 people that switched, so that bumped it up in 23. But as you can see, you get to 2020 and we're starting to have, just a consistent regular decline, and then a skyrocket from 21, 22, 23. And of course, there's a lot of reasons for that. That time frame obviously is sort of the post-pandemic time frame where sort of a lot of social justice dynamics were happening and a lot of workplace changes. We'll go more into that, but I just wanted you to see that we are bumping up into a more and more unionization. Okay, let's go to the next one. Focusing on the Pacific Northwest, we got here in Washington, 80 elections were held in 2023. 68 of them were successful for the union, 85%. Alaska, not a lot, but everything was successful. California is a big one, but generally speaking, the way to look at this is a pretty high success rate. So when a union files a petition for an election, they tend to have most of their homework done. I mean, I should add that I was a lawyer for the Teamsters for 5 years, about a decade or so ago, and I can tell you on the union side of things that if you're going to file a petition for an election, unions want to know that they have a lot more support than what they need to file the petition. They want to be successful. So these numbers tell me that they know how to do that, and they are being successful. Let's move to the next one. So I don't know how well you can see this slide, but it shows, generally speaking, throughout the country in each state, what the percentage of success on the elections have been. And as you can see on the West Coast, it's overall an 82.5% win rate. Again, there's different parts of the country where there's different levels of union density. We'll kind of walk through that in a minute. But I just wanted you to kind of get a sense of overall nationwide how successful these are. In some place, as a general rule, I think you've got red states, you've got blue states, you've got right to work states, you've got non-right to work states, and generally on the coasts and in certain areas, isolated spots like Chicago, you have substantially higher unionization and union success, union density. Okay, next slide. Younger workers is kind of an interesting dynamic. So again, post-pandemic, coming out of 2020, 21, 22, we're seeing a lot more young workers organizing. In fact, a lot of the campaigns that I've been involved with are really seem to be driven by, in the past few years, young workers coming out of college. I think there's a lot of reasons for this. I think you have, college dynamics with teaching, TA unions. You've got a lot of social justice protest movements on campus. People kind of get, into the workplace. Maybe there's some level of frustration with, what they were hoping for, what they're expecting, whether it's a combination of pay or just a sense of, what the employer is supposed to be doing for them. But what we see is a lot more young folks getting involved. Now, some of that, of course, is going to be driven by certain kinds of organizing. For example, I think Starbucks, on average, the workers that were organizing and pushing for those unions are going to be generally younger. So I think that helps to impact those numbers. But that's part of what's happening, is we're seeing a generation of people coming out of college and entering the workforce and bringing with them a sense of sort of renewed energy in the labor movement. And that's having an interesting impact. So there's a lot more young folks getting involved in organizing. Okay, next slide. So here we are, again, Pacific Northwest, Washington, Oregon, way up there. New York's, higher density. The US rate of 9.9%, if I remember correctly, that's a combination of public and private sector. Public sector in a lot of places is substantially, higher than, I think in everywhere, it's higher than the private sector. But again, I think it's interesting to note that we have, on the West Coast, we live in a fairly high density union environment where more people are focused or are aware, at least, of union workplaces. In some parts of the country, it's a lot less. Now, interestingly, Texas, it's 4.9% or less, but it'll be interesting to see. There's another slide that shows Texas is not exactly sleepy. All right, let's go to the next slide. This is all just sort of background information. Lots of strikes. More strikes now than there have been for a while. So these younger workers, more militant unions, more unions, getting really aggressive, getting involved, taking people out on strike. And, we all, I think, I'm not sure if you all know, but Teamsters had, a big battle against UPS. That they were considering bringing that whole system out on strike. They built up a strike fund of $300 million or something like that, and didn't have to use it. So now they're threatening employers all over the place that if you don't give us what we want, we're going to pay our members $1,000 a week to go walk on a strike line, even if that's more money than they make when they're working. So strikes have always been an issue, but I think that they are getting more intense, and unions are heading out and walking the picket line a bit more. Okay. All right, so this is the Texas one that I thought was kind of interesting. So strike activity, just in terms of where these things are happening, number of strikes per state. Again, you can see kind of the coasts, right, or more activity, higher union density, so it makes sense. Washington, Oregon, California, pretty decent amount of strike activity. I don't know what the story is in Texas. I haven't taken the time to go figure it out, but there's something interesting there. There must be a story there. Starbucks is not included in this chart. So yeah, not a lot of union activity in Texas, but whatever's happening there is pretty aggressive. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So when are strikes happening? And the thing I find interesting about this is, again, all just pulled from Bureau of Labor Statistics, just kind of get a sense of where are we, what's happening. I thought it was kind of interesting that this purple line represents strikes before the first contract. When there's a union that's been newly certified and you're bargaining over a first contract, it can take a while, and it can be contentious, and it can be difficult. But I think historically strikes during negotiations over a first contract were somewhat more rare, but it certainly seems to be bumping up. The norm, of course, is striking in between contracts. So you have a contract, it has an expiration date, you're bargaining over a new contract, you're expired, the union isn't getting what it wants, employer's not willing to go that far. The green line represents where most of the strikes happen. But again, an interesting increase in 22 and 23 on pre-first contract strikes. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, so now I want to walk through some basics of what you need to know about the unionization process. So if you're management, you're HR, you're in a leadership position at a company that has potential union activity, whether you're not union at all or you are in some places but don't want it to expand elsewhere. This is kind of big picture what you need to know. Okay, next slide. So I talked a little bit about the coming out of the pandemic and social justice issues, and as a result of sort of the change that we've had, unions have become much more savvy around using online platforms, using QR codes for authorization cards. They're working with a younger generation of workers. They're working in a climate that's essentially a little bit more friendly overall to the labor movement, and they're working with a group of employees. Large segment of the workforce is feeling like they need more out of their employer than has traditionally been given. So whether that's work-life balance, money, the ability to buy a house in expensive markets, whatever it is, the idea that being a barista, for example, would be a long-term career, that somebody can buy a house, it maybe wasn't something a lot of us considered in the past, but it is something that some folks are coming out of college, taking a job and feeling a sense that they want more out of what they have, and turning to labor to see what they can get. All right, let's move. So what are you looking for? Obviously, if you have union flyers sitting around, that's something you want to keep an eye on. But generally, there's a lot of signs that you might have some union activity. So you start having some people walking in groups. You have a single individual employee who's complaining about something, and you just have an employee who's complaining about something. But if you start to see a pattern of employees banding together and engaging with you about workplace issues, you might have something happening in the background. A lot of union organizers will come and spend time in and around the facility, depending on what type of business you have, parking lots, public areas. It's an opportunity for them to come in and engage with your workers. You start to hear words like protected activity or unfair labor practice or demand for recognition or whatever. These are labor law terms. And if you hear these things coming from your workers, you know for sure that there is an actual union in the background that's sort of helping to coach them. And when that happens, you want to start strategizing around next steps, because once you hear those kinds of phrases, or you start to see, you hear about authorization cards, or you start to see union literature in the workplace, it is almost certain that there is somebody in the background from, an organizer from a union who's helping to sort of orchestrate this process. And that's where the traps come in. That's where you need to be careful about how you interact with employees. So, ultimately, you're wanting to keep an eye out and see if you're noticing any of these signs. And if you are, it's time to figure out where to go next. Okay, so big picture again, in 30 minutes, I don't have a ton of time to walk through the details on this, but I want to give you kind of a general sense of the stuff you need to know about how this process works. So ultimately, the union's trying to figure out, and the employer might have a different opinion on, what is a bargaining unit? Is it the entire warehouse? Is it just the people that work with the widgets? Is it a bunch of different stores together? Is it one geographic area? So one of the things that gets dealt with in a hearing in prior to an election, or hopefully prior to an election, is the scope of the unit. The bargaining unit is anybody eligible to vote in the election, and if it's ultimately certified, then that's the group you're bargaining a contract for. And there's questions about who's in, who's out, different locations. Those are the issues that need to be fleshed out, and there's oftentimes not a lot of time to work through that. So keeping in mind that the union always has a heads up or a head start on you, because they're organizing long before the employer usually knows about it. So they already have a sense of who they want to organize. And once we find out about it in a variety of different ways, we may have an interesting dispute over the scope. How big is the bargaining unit? Who's involved and who's not? But union is trying to figure out what's called a showing of interest. What they're trying to do is get up to 30%. They want 30% or more. Usually a union wants more than 30% of this potential bargaining unit. They want them to sign authorization cards. So they're out there, they're trying to get them signed cards. The old-fashioned card might have been an actual paper card, and those still exist, but they are using QR codes now as well. Not a whole lot of rules govern how a union can get authorization card signatures. They're not really allowed to use fraud, but you got to prove that they did if you want to fight that issue. And what happens is that, oftentimes they're saying, hey, you want to come into this meeting and learn more about what's going on, sign this card, or sign this card for more information, or sign this card to get a free t-shirt. Or people are just showing up at their houses and talking to these employees and pressuring them to sign cards, and they're allowed to do that. And sometimes employees sign cards just because they don't want to deal with the pressure anymore. It doesn't mean that they're pro-union. It just means that they signed a card. But once the card is signed, it's signed. And now the union, if they get more than 30% or 30 or more, they will file a petition. Now, there's a couple of different things that can happen. The demand for recognition, if they reach 50% or more than 50%, if they get more than half of this bargaining unit, then they will probably potentially come to you and demand recognition. And that's a relatively new process that, under current law, which is being challenged actually today, it's being challenged, that this idea that the employer now has to file a petition for representation, or a petition for an election. So if you get a demand for recognition, you have a 2-week period to act, to do something. You get a demand for recognition, immediately, reach out to your friendly neighborhood labor lawyer and address what to do next. More traditional approach is a representation petition. So union has enough signatures, they feel pretty comfortable that they could win an election. They file a petition, and at that point, there's going to be an election at some point, maybe 3 weeks, 4 weeks, maybe 5 weeks away, but not that far. At that point, it's time to decide, what kind of campaign do you want to run? Do you want to sit back and do nothing, or do you want to have a voice? Do you want to tell your employees how you would prefer that they vote in this process? So that's where a lot of the work goes into, figuring out how to get that message out lawfully. We'll work through that in a minute. Then, of course, there's an election. It's run by the National Labor Relations Board, and if you win and there's no objections and everything sort of plays out, then you've got a year where that union can't file another petition for that group. And if you lose, you sit down and you try to bargain a contract. And in the meantime, while you've got a duty to bargain, you maintain status quo, no changes. Again, these are sort of high level. There's obviously nuances. So let's move on to the next slide. I want to get to you the do's and don'ts. So one of the most important things that I want to make sure you understand, just again at a high level, is that the NLRA, which is the federal law that governs all this stuff, it applies to every employer in the private sector. So more or less, it applies to union and non-union. So a lot of non-union employers think it doesn't matter for them because this law doesn't really apply to us. That's not true. All of these laws around worker organizing apply to the non-union as well. And it applies only to the protections under Section 7, which I'll talk about in a second here. Those protections apply only to employees. So one of the most important things for an employer to do early on is figure out who their supervisors are, because under federal labor law, there's management and there's labor. There's the employer and there's the employees. There's the boss and the workers. There's real black and white. There's not really a lot of middle ground. So many supervisors it really doesn't matter what their title is. It doesn't matter whether they're hourly or salaried. What matters is, do they meet this statutory test? Do they hire and fire and transfer and recall and promote and all that kind of stuff? Or do they effectively recommend those things? And do they exercise independent judgment? So there's a lot of details, a lot of nuance, and often not a lot of clarity around whether or not somebody is a supervisor. But it's really critical to figure that out, number one, because are they going to be in the unit or not? Number two, are they the ones behind the organizing? Because that's not okay. And that's something you can take action on. Supervisors are not allowed to engage in organizing activity, and it can really be a problem even for the union if that happens. Figuring out who your supervisors are probably the most important first step when there's a campaign, because I think if we go to the next slide, we'll probably see why. Well, maybe it's the one after that. So employees, again, not supervisors, employees have the right to, under Section 7, form, join, assist labor organizations, basically the right to unionize, but they also have the right to refrain from organizing. So in the context of a campaign, part of the process is to mobilize the people that don't necessarily know that they have the right, just as much right as the people pushing for a union, the folks that are not into it, the folks that really would prefer not to have a union, they don't often know that they have the same rights to campaign on their end. So that's a large part of what an employer campaign is about, is mobilization of your strong supporters. Okay, next slide. Okay, the do's and don'ts, the big stuff, and we can move to the next one. One of the main reasons to know who your supervisors are is you got to be able to figure out who to train on this stuff. Basic training on the do's and don'ts in a nutshell is tips and faux. So I don't know, I'm not looking at you, I'm looking at the screen, so I can't do a show of hands, but I would imagine many of you have heard the concept of tips and faux. In a nutshell, it's the stuff you're not allowed to do: tips, threats, interrogation, promise, surveillance. Next slide. Faux is stuff you're allowed to do. So supervisors, again, that's part of why we need to know who the supervisors, not allowed to threaten. There's lots of things that you can do inadvertently in the context of engaging with employees that could be perceived as a threat or could be spun as a threat. So basically any prediction that something bad will happen as a result of unionization is almost certainly a threat. Even if that thing could happen, even if it's true that, for example, there's a possibility of this plant shutting down, if you were to say that, of course, that's ultimately a threat. So anything that that comes off as a threat or could be perceived as a threat, and that's one of the reasons that disciplining a union leader, lead organizer, for example, that's one of the reasons that that's unlawful, because it's retaliation for protected activity, but it's also perceived by the rest of the bargaining unit as a threat. Okay, no threats. Again, this is what I'm doing this at a super high level in 30 minutes. You can move to the next slide. High level, 30 minutes. What needs to happen if there's a campaign in your workplace is immediately pull the real supervisor management team together and do an in-depth tips and faux training so they understand the do's and don'ts at a more detailed level. No interrogation. No asking employees really technically any questions about anything having to do with the union. And that is hard to do when you are trying to be a good manager. You're trying to engage with your employees, you're trying to have a relationship, and you're trying to find out what's going on. you can find out what's going on, and you can find out a lot of information in a well-run campaign. Employees will share a ton of information, but you can't ask them any questions. So part of the process of navigating a campaign is to learn how to get a lot of information without actually asking any questions. It is doable. So no interrogation. Let's go to P. No promises. So it's essentially the opposite of a threat. If you unionize, something bad will happen. If you don't unionize, something good will happen. Or implied promises. Also, you can't solicit grievances to try to find out what's causing all this, because it comes with an implied promise to fix it. So that's essentially the opposite of the T part. So no threats, no interrogation, no promises, and S is no surveillance or spying. I think the old school version of this was, a manager going to the parking lot at the union hall and taking pictures of people's license plates and reporting back on who was there. But there's a lot of ways that you can spy, a lot of ways that you can induce surveillance. So the basic idea is, we're not trying to go out of our way to see who's involved and who's not involved and how people feel and who's showing up to a meeting. But again, during a campaign, there's ample opportunity to figure that stuff out lawfully. But we can't give employees the impression that we are engaging in surveillance. So one of the things that employers need to understand is that and managers need to know, if there's union activity, let's say the Teamsters show up with a big truck and a giant inflatable rat, and all of a sudden there's a bunch of protesters outside. Most supervisors, their natural inclination, pull out the phone, start taking some video of it, because first of all, it's fascinating looking. Second of all, they probably want to send it to, someone up the chain. Don't do that. That's immediately surveillance. Just gives the employees the impression that you're filming them, which you technically are. Okay, that's the stuff you're not allowed to do. No tips, no threats, interrogation, promises, or surveillance. So what are you allowed to do? And what should you do in the context of a union campaign? Facts, opinions, experiences. That's the stuff you're allowed to do. Okay, next slide. Facts are, we're allowed to say in a campaign anything that is true, right? Not in a threat, but things that are true about collective bargaining, the uncertainty of collective bargaining, the fact that things can get better, they can get worse, or they can stay the same. Bargaining is unpredictable. Here's some interesting things about this particular union. By the way, all the union promises that they have made to you are, they can't necessarily force us to do that. All sorts of information about dues, anything that is factual we can share, and unions rarely share all of those facts. Okay, next slide. Opinions, you are allowed to have an opinion about unionization. Many employers are worried that they're not allowed to have them. You can share, you can explain why you don't think a union is right for this organization. Oftentimes that's what employees need to hear. Next slide, experiences. Most powerful thing you can do is explain your experience, your spouse's experience, your uncle's experience, other experiences. These are, I have worked in a union workplace, and here's what I found. My brother worked in a union workplace, and here's what his experience was. Oftentimes that can be very, very powerful. So in a campaign, management sharing facts, opinions, experiences, but they need to be trained how to do that without violating tips. Next slide. Again, like I said, very high level. So critically, you've got to have, as leaders in an organization, you got to have a position on the issue. You got to be able to own that position. You got to be able to articulate that position. It's really not effective if you don't, have that ownership over the messaging. And if you just kind of sit back and hope for the best, unions really control the message. Next slide. So the reason that the tips and faux stuff matters is that when if you violate tips and you break the rules and you commit an unfair labor practice, which is a federal charge, if you win an election, it might be overturned. You might have to have another election. And if you do it a serious unfair labor practice, you might find that there's no election at all, that you get certified as a unionized employer without any election. So those are the risks associated with committing unfair labor practices. But if you don't do anything, then the only message the employees hear is from the union, and more likely you end up with a union. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to, in 30 seconds or less, because I want to be respectful of your time, I'm going to go straight to the sort of core issue, and the core issue of avoidance, positive employee relations. So let's skip this slide because I just want to get to the core. We're going to skip this one too. Okay. Most of your employees, according to most polls, are not nearly as engaged. The bulk of the employees are not engaged. You have some that are actively disengaged, 15%, and you've got some that are actively engaged. But ultimately, there's the bulk of your workers is probably the group that needs the most support. Rather than going through the rest of these slides, I'm just going to give you what I think is the strongest union avoidance strategy there is. Again, because it's 9:30. If your employees feel respected, if your employees feel heard, if your employees feel like you know their names and you know their spouse's names, and they have a feeling of being in on things, they understand what's going on and why things are going on. It turns out that pay is not usually the biggest issue that's driving unionization. It might be an issue, but ultimately pay and benefits can be worked on. It is the employee's sense that they are part of the employer's culture and that they're respected as people. Generally speaking, what we have found is that happy employees who have a stronger relationship with their employer than they do with union organizers tend not to organize. Even if there are pay issues, benefit issues, even if there are working condition issues, they can be worked on. When they feel strongly connected to their employer and the supervisors know who they are and respect them as people, as a general rule, you're much safer from unionization. We can scroll through, I think, the rest of these slides in order to get them. That's the CLE attendance verification. So there is a code. There it is, attendance verification code. So this is for the CLE credit. SS, you can see it right there in number 3, like I said, Safar Shah. SS0077. That's your attendance verification code for today. And again, this was a ridiculously, quick period of time to give you the big picture on where we are in union stuff and how to kind of deal with it in your workplace. So any kind of follow-up issues that you want to reach out on, you know how to get in touch with me. I think there might have been a slide back that had my email on it, but somehow you can find me or reach out to whoever your friendly neighborhood labor lawyer is. So thank you much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.